It's on now. About 6 months ago, Tom Crampton and I were talking about classes and things to teach, and he asked me what I'd like to teach, and I said, well, I've been thinking about something. How about a study in the books in the New Testament that nobody ever studies? And he said, what books are you talking about? And I said, Philemon, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, John, and Jude. He said, sounds like a good idea to me, so I've been working on this. And today I'd like to start a study with you in the book of Philemon. The first thing you got to learn about Philemon is it's hard to find. Some of you are already looking in your table of contents because you don't know where it is. If you're looking in the Pew Bible, it's on page 1818, 1818. Otherwise, turn to the table of contents and you'll find the page. But for those of you who really want to leaf through and find it, it's really not that hard when you learn that it is just before Hebrews. Any of you remember hearing preaching or having a class in Philemon? Maybe not. So this is going to be, I think, interesting. In most of the Bibles, it's one page. It's one reason why it's so hard to find. But a lot of people have never studied it and don't know what it's about. These classes aren't going to be so long because I taught Acts for a year and a half, but Acts has 28 chapters and Philemon has 25 verses, So it's a different kind of thing. Okay, here's the beginning of Philemon. And we're starting for a minute in verse 1, but I want to give you a little bit of background here. Philemon was written near the end of Paul's first time in prison at Rome. You know where you can find the Bible talking about Paul's first prison time in Rome? It's the end of the book of Acts, chapter 28, the last chapter in the book of Acts. You don't need to turn there. But do you remember what it says as to how long he was in prison in Rome? 2 years. But it was kind of what we would call a house arrest. It says he rented his own place, and he was in his own house for 2 years. But the Romans had a pretty simple way of saying that you stayed a prisoner. Someone want to tell me what that way was? Chained him to a what? A guard, yeah, a soldier. A Roman soldier. And if they were more dangerous people, they would chain them to two, one on each side. And the soldier had a strong interest in making sure that this person didn't somehow get loose and run off. You want to know how they had a strong interest in that? You know? What was the penalty? Huh? It could be, but more likely it was death. If the Roman soldier let the person escape, generally they were killed. Straightforward and simple. It worked, too. So at any rate, Paul was in prison in Rome. Now, Acts 28 ends with pretty much that verse. And so we don't really know what happened after Acts 28. Maybe he had to actually spend some time in a jail, which they did have. They were terrible places to be in jail. And maybe he was released. But it appears that his first stay in prison, he was released. And most of us have studied this to realize that Paul went to prison a second time in Rome. And this time he wasn't released. Generally believe that Paul was killed the second time. And we're going to read some out of Colossians. And Colossians was written when Paul was in prison in Rome the second time. In Philemon, look down at verse 22, if you're there. Paul asked Philemon, he's writing this letter to this guy Philemon, and he says, at the same time, prepare me a lodging, for I hope through your prayers I shall be given to you. In other words, when he wrote this letter to Philemon, he was really expecting to be released fairly soon. And apparently he was, and came to Colossae where Philemon lived. The second time in jail, he didn't get released. Okay, how do we know that Philemon lived in Colossae? Because it's not said that in Philemon. We're going to do just a little bit of looking around in other books, especially in Colossians. So if you got one finger in Philemon and another finger in Colossians, this will help. There are three people who are significant in this book. One of them is Paul, who's in jail in Rome. Another one is Philemon, who's a Christian who lives in Colossae. Colossae is what we would call a province or a state. In the country today is called Turkey, but there it was called Asia Minor, and they had a province in Turkey that was just called Asia, and it was over toward the west side of Turkey, down toward the sea. And it wasn't, I mean, it's pretty good size, but it was a lot smaller than Michigan. Might have been something like 5 or 6 counties in Michigan is how big it was. And that's where Philemon lived. And the third person who's important in this letter is Onesimus. And Onesimus was a slave of Philemon. And this business about him being a slave is very, very important here. Well, anyway, if you got a finger in Philemon, turn over to Colossians chapter 4. We're going to read a couple of different things in Colossians 4. A couple of places in Colossians, actually. Because here we're going to find the only other place in the Bible where Onesimus, the slave, is mentioned. It starts back in Colossians 4 with verse 7, where he's writing to the church in Colossians, and he says that one of Paul's travel companions, Tychicus, in verse 7, is going to bring them information about him and him being in jail. And verse 8, I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know about our circumstances, and they may encourage your hearts. And with him, Tychicus, Paul is sending this slave, Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother. What does that mean when he says our faithful and beloved brother? Was he Paul's brother? No, he means he's a Christian. He's a fellow Christian. And Philemon, Paul calls faithful and beloved, who, in the next phrase says, who is one of your number, who is one of your own. What does that mean? Your own what? I'm sorry? Household. No, sort of. Not family household, though. Kind of a spiritual household, maybe. He was the congregation. He was a member of the congregation in Colossae. Okay? You with me? Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Anyway, he says they will inform you about the whole situation here. He's letting the church, Paul is letting the church in Colossae know that he's doing okay in jail, and they're going to tell details about him being in jail. I'm mentioning this just because this is this guy, Onesimus, that is the only 2 times in the Bible that it's talked about. Well, going on with a little bit, and by the way, I need to mention, Colossians was not written while Paul was in jail the first time. Colossians is written when Paul was in jail the second time. And what happened to Paul at the end of his second time being in jail? Yeah, the Romans killed him. He was probably killed around AD 64, 65. Philemon is written around AD 60 or so. So this is the last 5-6 years of Paul's life. And the first time the Romans let him go, the second time he didn't let him go. Okay, the next one is in Philemon 2, verse 2, back at Philemon, it says that the letters are written to Apphia, our sister, to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. Now, Apphia is a female name, Archippus is a male name, and I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions today, so, pay attention. Archippa, our sister. Was Archippa Paul's natural sister? No. What was she? Why does he say our sister? Sister in Christ. Okay? And Archippus, our fellow soldier, was he in the military? No. Our fellow soldier means our fellow soldier in teaching the gospel. You see what I'm saying? This can be so easy to understand when you understand that people use figures of speech. You know what figures of speech are in English? Well, English isn't the only language that has them. But I'm telling you, There has been innumerable, untold problems in people studying the Bible where they don't understand figures of speech. They want to take it literal. Archippus was a soldier. Apphia must have been his sister. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying that she was her sister in Christ, and Archippus was his fellow worker. Now, Archippus is also found in the book of Colossians. If you turn over Colossians 4:17, this is the very end of the book, and 4:17, Colossians 4:17, says, "And say to Archippus," the same guy, "take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may finish it," or fulfill it. Well, ministry, does that mean he was a preacher? Does that mean he was a minister? No. The word here is diakonon, which is similar to diakonos, which we use to mean deacon, but the ordinary use of that word just means a servant. And that ministry here isn't talking about a position, it's talking about what he did. And he had a work in Christ that he did. Maybe he preached there. Maybe, as it says in Philemon 2, what does it say about him in Philemon 2 as to what he did? Flip back over there. It says, "Into the church in your house." Well, what's that mean? They were meeting in his house. And we don't know how many there were, of course, but it would take a little bit of work to have a house prepared to have people coming in on a Sunday and worshiping there. And if the church was large, it took more, And sometimes people would churches were meeting in houses because a Christian had a pretty good-sized room in their house. And a lot of Romans in houses, if they had a little bit of money, they would actually have the house be with a courtyard in the middle that was open to the air. Pompeii, was a town that was destroyed by a volcano in the 1st century. It's near Naples. I visited there when I traveled around Europe. And I saw a number of these houses that were not, rich people, but people that had just a little bit of money. They had a courtyard in the middle that's open to the air, and the house was actually around the open courtyard with a walkway here, and then the rooms were off the walkway. I saw a number of those in Pompeii. There was another town buried by Mount Vesuvius that exploded called Herculaneum, and I visited it, and I saw a number of these houses in Herculaneum. So it's real possible the church met in this open area in the center of his house that was open to the sunshine. By the way, do we find church buildings in the New Testament? Can't find them. Where did the church meet in Jerusalem, where the church started? First, you got to know the church started with thousands of members. Acts chapter 2. There were thousands of people who were Christians. Where did they get together? The temple courtyard. Now, the temple courtyard had some areas that had shaded areas because they had like a colonnade that would be, a kind of a roof there, but it was all open to the air. That was the first place the church met in Jerusalem. The church was huge at the beginning, and they met in the temple courtyard. Well, the temple was right there, and of course, all these people were Jews, so they felt comfortable being there because they were Jewish people. But there's no church buildings in the New Testament. Is it scriptural for us to have church buildings? Well, I hope so. Especially in Michigan, yeah. I've never seen this, but I saw a missionary talk one time where he had taken pictures of churches of Christ in Africa, and there was the meeting place of this good-sized congregation of our brethren. There were 250 or 300 that met, and the meeting place was this great big tree. And he took a picture also of the little sign that they had nailed to the tree saying, "The church meets here." And that was their church sign. It was about this big, nailed into the side of the tree. But they would get together and sit under the tree, and they'd have church. They don't have winter down there, really. So, nothing wrong with doing that. But why are we scripturally having a church building? Someone want to take a shot at that one? You're doing too many of these, Wally. You know that. You've always done that. That's right. When it says meet, it means you've got the freedom to meet in a good way. You can meet in the outdoors. You can meet in a rented place. You can build your own building. But that authorizes what we have here. Okay, anyway, this guy, Archippus, and Aphia, by the way, was probably his wife, had the church meet in his house. Okay, but at any rate, you go back over to Colossae. Archippus, in Colossians 4:17, had this ministry. Maybe his ministry was his work, his service, was providing his house for the church. But Archippus was in Colossae. That's where he lived, okay? And so we got a couple indications that Philemon lived in Colossae also. But there's another one. If you go to Philemon verse 23, you find this verse about a fellow named Epaphras. I may not be saying that correctly, but bear with me. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you. Epaphras was in jail with Paul, okay? And that's why he mentions him in this letter to Philemon, who lives in Colossae, because Philemon knew Epaphras. And he's saying that Epaphras is in jail with him. If you turn back over to Colossians, we're going to find this fellow mentioned again in Colossians chapter 1, verse 7. Okay? Colossians 1, verse 7 says, verse 6 says that the gospel had been taught to these folks. Verse 7, just as you learned it from Epaphras. Epaphras was apparently also a preacher. He was apparently traveling with Paul, and he got put in jail with Paul. But here's where it's saying that Epaphras was the person that the Colossian Christians had learned the gospel from. And in verse 7, he goes on to say, our beloved fellow bondservant, who is a faithful servant of Christ on our behalf. So this fellow that is mentioned in Philemon was also in Colossae. You see what I'm saying? So it's fairly clear that Philemon was living in Colossae. Okay, I like a class with conversation. I'm trying to get you folks to talk some. Anytime you want to ask something or say something, raise your hand or throw something at me or something. Any comments on any of this so far? Right. Right. It's all very true. We don't know if there will come a time when the church in the United States might have to do the same thing. It's possible. And that's all very true. It's also, in addition to that, Rome in the first century had very probably 1 million people. That's a very large city. You didn't have buses, you didn't have taxi cabs, you didn't have cars. People generally walked, ordinary people did. And so if you read Romans carefully, especially the last chapter, Romans 16, you find out there's more than one congregation meeting in Rome. And a reason could be that it was too far for people to walk to go to one place. And so they had little congregations. And in Rome, it also talks about the church meeting in people's houses, So there's a variety of reasons why you would have small congregations meeting here and there. Okay, let's move on to talk about Onesimus a little bit. But to talk about Onesimus, we have to talk about slavery. And I developed a few things to talk to you about slavery. And I've learned that there's a lot of misunderstandings about slavery in general and slavery. First thing is real simple. What is slavery? It's people owning people. You got to understand that real clearly. And the key word here is owning. I own this book. I own a pen. I own this shirt. What can I do with this shirt and this book and a pen? I can give it away. I can sell it. I can break it. I can throw it away. Whatever I want because I own it. Slavery is people owning people. Slaves were bought and sold. Slaves could be treated well, or they could be treated terribly, beaten within an inch of their life. Slaves at times, many times, including in Rome as well as in this country years ago when we had slavery here, slaves could be killed by their master and nothing happens to the master. They were property. That's what they were. And this has been a real problem in this country, and it was a real problem in the Roman Empire. Today, there are still slaves. Are slaves legal anywhere in the world, anywhere in the world at all today? No, in pretty much every single country except for one country. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But there's estimated that there's 40 million people who are slaves today in about 5 main categories. So I'm going to go over all this real quick. The one country that has legal slaves today, want to take a guess? North Korea. North Korea has what's called forced labor camps. That's not what we call it, that's what they call it. Now, a prison in North Korea, they have some regular jails where you go and sit and wait until you can get out. But they have a lot of these forced labor camps with lots of people in them. It's estimated that there's at least 2,500,000 people in the forced labor camps in North Korea. Forced labor camps means exactly what those words say. You don't go in a jail cell and sit down and wait for lunch. You work all day long until it's dark or you fall down from being too tired, and then you try to go home. They don't feed you well. They don't treat you well. You are slaves for the period of time they're there. And there are people in these forced labor camps that are given terms of specific times, and it's never a year or two. That's a regular jail. If you've got a longer term, and a lot of these terms are 10 or 20 years, you stay there until you leave, and a lot of times people don't leave because they die from overwork, or they die from not having enough food, or they die because the guard gets angry at them and shoots them and kills them, and nothing happens to the guard. But sometimes by pure happenstance. I'm going to talk about Stalin here in a minute. But in North Korea, there's a whole multitude of things that you can do that get you in trouble with somebody, and you can go to jail. And often if you go to jail, it's not just you, it's your entire family, your children, even who are adults living apart from you, and your parents. The whole family goes to prison. And a number of times they die there. I'm serious. There's another kind of forced labor camp in North Korea that generally people never leave. They're there until they die. And in a case where you have a camp that has both men and women, children get born. And when those children are born, they are also born to never leave the camp. They are born slaves in North Korea. There's a woman named Yeonmi Park. I don't remember how to spell her name. But if you go on Facebook, you can find a number of speeches by her, and she's written a book. And she talks about living in North Korea. She talks about seeing routinely dead people on the side of the road when she was walking someplace in her town because they had periods of starvation back then. Oh, and by the way, right now in North Korea is entering into another period of starvation. I mean that literally. The head of North Korea, this fat guy that's one of the Kims, I forget, Kim Il-sung or something like that. He made a speech here a week ago where he's talking about times are getting more tough in North Korea, and they're having a hard time with getting food. They've always had a hard time having food in North Korea, but now it's getting worse. And there's going to be people dying in the streets in North Korea. And why don't we see about this in the newspapers? You know the simple answer to that? Because they don't let reporters in from the outside. There's no free press. There's no cameras. There's no picture taking. They hide it from the world. And the government says that they're living in the greatest country on earth. I'm not joking about that. That's the words that they say to their own people. And one of the big things that this woman I mentioned, Yeonmi Park, says is that she heard this and she believed it. As terrible as her life was in North Korea growing up as a child, she thought the rest of the world was worse. But then after a while, she came to realize that China, which was not far from where she lived across the river, she realized they had to be a whole lot better than North Korea, because in North Korea, they didn't have electricity very much. They didn't have lights. And from across the river, she could see lights over in China. She knew they had to be better off than the folks in North Korea. And ultimately, she went across the river and escaped and so on.
A lot of North Korea is due to intimidation. I've got two friends that are from Iraq. And I'm trying to stretch this out, I don't know, my short class, right?
Go ahead.
Every Iraqi household in Iraq had two things in it. And if you didn't have one of those things in it, you were beat. A picture of Saddam Hussein somewhere in that house. A daily newspaper. Two things every day in that house.
Yeah.
Intimidation.
Intimidation. And North Korea is the worst in the world at this kind of thing. I'm not trying to take the whole class time on this. We will get to Philemon. Maybe not today, but we will get to Philemon. But I can't talk about slavery, especially more modern times, without talking about Stalin, who ran forced labor camps in Russia between 1918 and 1960. And there were over 25 million people. And there was a book written about this. It became very famous. The name of the book was Gulag Archipelago. It was written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Anybody ever heard of this? Yeah, okay. How big is the book? It's so big that they printed it in 3 books. And each one of them has 400 pages or something. This is a real task to read this whole thing. And I read it, and it's unbelievable. But in those years in Russia, the Gulag, and this is the word the Russians used, Solzhenitsyn himself was in the Gulag himself for 8 years. And there were 25 million people that were held in 476 forced labor camps in Russia. Finally, in 1960, after Stalin died, Khrushchev closed the whole thing down. They don't exist anymore. But at any rate, today, there are forced labor camps. Most of them are today in North Korea. But there are other reasons, ways of having slavery in the world today. The second one is human trafficking, which is almost always women for either domestic work or sex. And this includes women in the United States, where people talk to a young woman someplace or older woman and say, we can get you into the United States and you can make a lot of money and you can have a better life. And they come over here and they're literally sold to some American family, good old U.S. citizens, who use these people for domestic work around their house, and they have no freedom, and they don't want to talk to anybody because they know they're illegal and they're afraid if they talk to a police officer or anybody else, they'll be deported. And the other reason, of course, is prostitution. So anyway, the third way that people are slaves in the world today in various countries is debt bondage. You get in debt and you can't do anything about it, so you are sold into slavery to work and pay off your debt. The fourth way is forced marriage, and in many countries this is the honest-to-goodness selling of girls by their parents to somebody else to be their wife, and she's not a wife as much as she is a slave. And the women and the parents get money. This has been a very long, old tradition in countries like Thailand of selling your daughters to make money for the parents. And the fifth one is child soldiers. Today, this is found a lot in Africa. If you've read some news articles about some of these terrible militias or illegal armies that exist in Africa, many of the soldiers are 6, 7, and 8, 9 years old. And they are not free to leave. They were brought in forcibly, and they have to stay. They are slaves in an army that maybe they had no interest. Okay, that's slavery in general. People owning people. Slavery in the United States. Before the Civil War started, there were 4 million slaves in the United States. People owning people where you could buy, sell them, beat them, kill them. But did you know that there were 500,000 free blacks in the United States before the Civil War? There are a lot of things people don't know the truth about. And by the way, a number of these free blacks were recruited into the northern U.S. Army, the Union Army, and fought against the South during the Civil War as time went on.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
What was the occupation in these camps that they did? Was it farming or
Farming, mining,
mining?
agriculture.
Yeah, okay. They had enough to keep them busy, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. They would work from daylight to dark a lot of times, and including children. Including children. Oh, yeah, the forced labor is not easy labor. This isn't sitting at a desk and typing or something like this. This is where you were using shovels and tools and walking a lot and bending your back, and you're not being fed very well. It's a very terrible thing. The point here is it was slavery. It's a form of slavery. You couldn't walk away. They had big fences, and you couldn't get over the fences, in North Korea especially. At any rate, they think that slavery in the United States. When there were 4 million slaves before the Civil War, there were only about 31 million total people living in the United States. So it was a sizable percentage. Today in the United States, it's considered that there are about 400,000 people who are slaves in the United States today. Almost all of them are, they're all illegals here, but most all of them are human trafficking, again, as I said, for domestic and sex. And if you're thinking that this is something that isn't anywhere around here, well, I want to tell you a tiny little story. I was raised in Flint. I took a school bus to school every day. 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, every day we would drive by Applegate Chevrolet, which is on South Saginaw Street, if you know Flint. Right across the street from Applegate Chevrolet, during those years in the early 60s, was a little building that said Korean Massage. And I wondered about that place because in the daytime I never saw anybody go in and out when I would be coming by in the bus. But, I'm a kid. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention until one day there was an article in the Flint Journal about how the police had raided the place and they had closed it down. Korean Massage was not just Koreans. It was other nationalities and some American girls who had been kidnapped and things like that. And it had nothing to do with massage. It was a house of prostitution in Flint, Michigan, when I was a high schooler. I rode by it every day in the bus. And the girls were not allowed to leave. They had no freedom. In the daytime, while I didn't see anybody go inside, the doors were locked and they slept in there. At nighttime was when they worked. They were slaves in Flint, Michigan in the 1960s. And the only reason I found out about it was after the police raided the place. It was in the Flint newspaper. I want to talk about slavery in the past. People think just about slavery in a small thing. We think about slavery, we think about the American South until the Civil War. But in all of human history, for thousands and thousands of years, back to the very beginning of human history, there have been slaves in every country. Every country has had slavery. Just about every country. In Africa, black Africans were usually kidnapped in peace or captured in war by other black Africans. They were then taken to ports to sell to mainly British ships run by British. Now, where did the British take these? The common idea is they took them to North America and they were sold to be slaves in the United States. Here's a statistic that will surprise a lot of people. Less than 5% of the slaves taken from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, North America, Central America, South America, less than 5% came to the United States. Less than 5%. Well, where did they go? They didn't really go to Canada. Canada didn't really have slavery like that to speak of. They went to Central America. Most of them went to South America. And there were slaves. And by the way, the black Africans that captured these people for sale, why did they do it? For money and guns. The African tribes, nations, whatever you want to call them, they were constantly fighting each other. And they had a big advantage if they had guns. So when one of these British ships came to one of these port towns to get slaves, they would have a whole passel of rifles and guns to to trade for the slaves, and because that's what the African people down there, African people wanted. At any rate, a lot of people don't know this. The Romans, when they conquered England back in the 200s, 300s, 100s AD, they had slaves in England. When the Romans finally left in the 400s, slavery was still in England itself, but over a period of time it kind of went away. After the 12th century, there were no slaves in Britain. But Britain, as time passed, and Britain formed colonies in various places around the world, they allowed slaves in the British possessions, but not in England itself. But in 1807, Britain abolished slave trading. They wouldn't let British ships anymore carry slaves anywhere in the world. And in 1833, Britain abolished slavery in the British colonies. So anywhere the Britons still had control over the people, in big countries like India, small countries like British Guinea and South America, places like that, slaves were all freed in those countries in 1833. A lot of people also don't realize that in 1808 that the U.S. Congress prohibited the bringing in of any more slaves to the United States. 1808. Now, the reason why I'm saying those details, and we're going to have to close here in maybe 5 minutes or so, is because there are some folks today saying that the Revolutionary War was a war all about slavery. That is just simply not true. The American Civil War started in 1776. In 1776, slavery was legal in parts of the United States, not everywhere in the United States, but it was still legal with Britain. Not in Britain, but in the colonies, okay? So we had no gripe with the British about slavery in 1776 because to us it was legal and to the British it was legal in the colonies. You see what I'm saying? And it's just a false statement. The Revolutionary War was not over slavery. Okay, moving along before we get running out of time. Slavery in the Roman Empire. People in the Roman Empire in the first century were in three large categories: Romans, slaves, and everybody else. And the everybody else weren't slaves, so they were called freedmen and freed women. You get me? That doesn't mean necessarily they were free, because the Jews weren't slaves, but the Jews were occupied by Rome. You see what I'm saying? So they were under Roman control, but individually they were not slaves. So you have Romans, and you have free people, and you have slaves. Well, how many actual slaves were in the Roman Empire in, say, the first century? I did a number of reading of different books, and it really depends upon who you read, because there's really no clear numbers for this. Why? Because in the Roman Empire, they simply didn't count slaves. Because, to use a pun, slaves didn't count. They just didn't care how many there were or anything like that. They didn't tax slaves. Slaves just, they were slaves. They didn't matter. They count Romans, but they didn't count slaves. So, how many people were in the total Roman Empire? In the past, I have said as many as 100 million people. In the reading I did in preparation for this, I'm thinking maybe it was more like 60 million total people in the Roman Empire, but apparently between 10 and 15 million slaves, which means as much as 1 in 4 people in the entire Roman Empire were actual slaves. Now, others were oppressed, like the Jews were, but real slaves, where somebody owns you, was as much as 1 in 4. And there are some records from the Roman times of how many slaves there were in Rome and in Italy itself. And between 25 and 30% of the population of Rome were slaves. 1/4. 1/4. 1 out of every 4 people in Rome was slaves. And by the way, it was pretty much the same population in the country of Italy. Outside of Rome, most of these people would be farm workers. There were 3 major slave revolts that are well known in the Roman Empire. All of them were in Italy. The last of these was headed by a fellow, you've probably heard his name. He was a prisoner named Spartacus. There was a movie came out years ago named Spartacus. The person that played Spartacus was Kirk Douglas. Pretty good movie if you've never seen it. And it's a pretty accurate movie for what happened in this third large slave rebellion in Italy, there were thousands and thousands of slaves that ran away from their plantations and places like that, and they fought. And the Romans sent a couple armies down, and they beat one army, and then they sent another army down to South Italy, where the slaves were holed up in some hills. And finally, they were conquered. And here's where there's something that's kind of nasty to say, but it happened. The Romans military, when they conquered these folks, a lot of them they just killed. But there was about 6,000 of them that were still alive. And they said, we are going to make what would you call it? An example of these folks so that no Roman slave will ever rebel again. Anybody know what they did? Christ was killed how? Crucifixion, a cross, right? Now the crosses in Roman times sometimes were our shape of the cross. Sometimes they were more like a T, But at any rate, the Romans crucified all 6,000 of them. And they crucified them on the big road that went from southeast Italy back toward Rome, which is on the west side of Italy. And every so often they'd put another cross up and they'd hang another person on it, all 6,000 of them on the distance of, it might be 250 or 300 miles between southeast Italy and Rome. And they had this whole road all the way up of crosses, 6,000 people they crucified. And you do know that they put them on the cross alive, which means they all died on the cross. Very, very nasty thing for them to do. Finally, I think I'm going to stop here because it's 15 till. But next week we're going to start out with a very short discussion of slavery in the New Testament, and then we will, honest to goodness, I promise you, start with Philemon verse 1. Okay? Any comments or anything you want to say here? Okay. Well, we don't have very many. Next Sunday, the campers will be back. We'll have probably twice as many. But if you mentioned to anybody you enjoyed the class, tell people about it. Maybe we can get some more people in here. Appreciate you being here. Aren't you glad you're not a slave?